Three, two, one. All right, welcome to, I think this is the 6th religious deconstruction episode. Jacob did not join me on the last one, but Dorian and I had a good talk. So Jacob is joining me today, as always, and we have a special guest, a friend of mine who is going by Anonymous right now. Maybe related to Q Anonymous in some way. My old nickname for her, she's a very old friend of mine, is Crab. So we'll go ahead and Crabby, yeah. So we'll pop the on the phone graphic up now. Yep. Boom, done. Nice. And so Jacob, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. I spent the morning sort of soaking up I don't even know what you would call Jordan Peterson's philosophy. He was on a podcast that I enjoy, so I watched it for the host, not for him, but I've just got, sort of vague Christian liberal platitudes floating around the brain. So
perfect time for it.
I mean, it is Sunday after all, right? It's like going to Sunday service.
Right, yeah. And Crab, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. I took my child to the doctor the other day, and I'm pretty sure I picked something up because I feel, not great, but that's okay. I'm good otherwise. How are you?
Well, no, nobody ever asked that back.
Oh.
And I'm usually a mess, so I don't want to answer the question anyways.
Yeah, sorry. We'll pretend like I didn't ask. Everything's great.
Because I know I'm the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Please.
Me not asking is poor manners. It's actually the opposite. It's me being like,
I know. I'm not
That's
offended
fair.
by it. I'm the host.
That's
I'm
fair.
not supposed to have feelings, all right? I'm doing okay. Last night I got pretty lit AF and went into a coma, and I barely got out of it in time to do this. So
that's very unlike you.
Yeah, I know.
I'm shocked
as someone
to
who's
hear
known me
such a
for
thing.
16, 17 years, this is the first time you've encountered this situation, right?
Yeah. I was thinking last night that we've known each other for like half of our lives, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys are like day one homies then, like
we are.
Yep.
Years and years.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
So our topic today is we didn't grow up in the same church or anything like that, but we grew up as friends, and we both experienced our deconstructions sort of not at the same time. I was a little bit of an early bloomer in that regard, and we wanted to talk about sexism in the church. So you are a very studious person, and I know that you have a bunch of notes, so I'm not sure if you want to just hit the ground running, or if you want me to go into some detail that maybe sparks your notes, or I don't know.
I can hit the ground running a little bit, and then a little back and forth would be cool. But I just kind of wanted to talk about, I guess, my early experiences with sexism in the church started really young. I can't even remember, but I was like born and raised in the church. It was like a second home. And I remember struggling with the ideology of like, women are supposed to submit to their husbands. This idea that women submit and men then love their wives, which was kind of like the reasoning that was always fed to me of, I would be like, well, why do women have to submit to their husbands? Like, what's up with this? How come it's not the other way around? And I realized as I got older and grew and started to deconstruct that this is really more about power dynamics than love, right? Like this is about subjugation of women and control,
right.
Which is really the thread of sexism in the church. So it was kind of that verse. It was like very specific verses that I would really struggle with. Women should remain silent in the church. So the first one I refer to in Submit to Your Husband, that's in Ephesians, if people are interested.
Yeah, and if you want to throw out some verses, I can pop them up on the screen and stuff like that.
Yeah,
so
I've just got Ephesians 5:22. That was the Submit to Your Husbands.
Ms. Crabb, can you kind of like, just for my own edification / context, can you kind of explain? I'm assuming that you grew up in some sort of like non-denominational fundamentalist evangelical church community.
Yeah, 100%. Yep.
So like what? Because like my exposure to it is mostly just like a long. So I was raised Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a long-standing interest in kind of Christian sectarianism. And I've also worked, just by chance, one of my jobs, several of the people that worked several of the people that I worked in close contact with were observant, practicing evangelicals. Some of them were fundamentalists, some were more mainline.
Yeah.
So just, by way of self-introduction, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that was definitely my my upbringing, and it's very like biblically, like literalism for the most part.
Yeah, the word of God, etc.
Exactly. Yep. And like none of it contradicts itself, and
like that. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, like, so my biggest gripe, mostly with, my admittedly, a lay person's understanding of theology,
mm-hmm.
my longstanding kind of gripe or reason that I still adhere to I don't know, what I would call like a benevolent Catholic chauvinism theologically is that, like, well, the biggest difference the biggest problem for me is that Catholicism adheres to the importance of tradition and biblical hermeneutics, whereas American evangelicalism specifically just kind of dispenses with that and says, well, no, not like, the Bible is a living document. So kind of to your point, it's at once an inerrant document, ironclad, but also there's an amazing degree of like relativism.
Oh yeah.
In evangelical hermeneutics, where it's just like, just a good example for the normies would be, the just wellspring of support that Trump received from evangelical leaders, which, to the normie blue check NPR New York Times reading audience, it would be like, how could the religious right back Trump? And it's like, well, if you actually understand the theology, then it makes complete sense.
Yep. Yeah, it does. Yeah, for sure.
Again, like, and then I'll shut up and I'll stop mansplaining.
No.
Another gripe I have, is like, Catholicism maintains that good works are necessary.
Yep.
In order to attain salvation, whereas evangelicalism pretty much makes it a matter of like ideological purity and adherence to this kind of like austere moral code without any necessity. And not even to the point that it's almost like not even to the point that good works are not necessary, but it's almost like the reaction is like, why would I do that? And here, I mean, like pretty specifically, like the way in which, there are evangelical conservatives at the forefront of like mainstream Republican or conservative politics who are just so virulently anti-helping, which is like odd considering you supposedly follow a set of teachings that are radically about helping. And I mean, I guess I don't want to speak for anyone other than myself, but like Michael, I feel like some of the stuff that, or I guess, I don't know. Yeah. Part of like what has evolved for me over our conversations over the past several weeks has been like, at least for me, like part of my alienation with regards to like institutional religion is that I do like, you know, I'm an armchair Marxist. So I also consider myself like, you know, to actually read into the figure of Christ or his teachings, it's like there's a certain level of disgust to be had for institutional religion because it so readily just sort of moves afield of him as a historical or religious figure in his actual teachings and his
for sure
comportment.
Yeah, and I think you kind of go back to like that story of Jesus in the temple where he's like overturning the tables, right? Like Jesus was hardcore, like not that. And I think that was a big part of the beginning of my deconstruction, was just seeing like the contradictions of all of that. Like this is how Jesus tells us to be, right? And then like cultural evangelicalism is so the opposite of that. And it was just kind of like disgusting, you know, like it really is.
Well, I mean, it part of what's kind of odd, I guess, or not odd, I don't know, like part of what's interesting is so in grad school, I wrote a paper. I was in a class that was on the rise of the historical origins of fascism and then the rise of a neo-fascist movement now-ish. And the paper that I wound up writing was essentially the point that I made was, or the contention that I was kind of interested in trying to explore was, a key difference between continental European, well, actually not even continental European, but also like Scandinavian and then mostly Scandinavian and continental European fascists, you know, they have this pre-Christian pagan folk tradition to fall back on as kind of an ideological substrate, whereas this country was founded as a Judeo-Christian nation. And I take seriously that proposition, which is bandied about by the religious right, where they, you know, browbeat us with this is a Judeo-Christian nation. But yeah, okay, let's take that seriously. And so what that means is, you know, this was, in terms of whiteness, this country was virgin soil. So, of course, the religious substrate here isn't pre-Christian. It is radically Christian, and it is a very non-loving, rugged individualist, literalist, not, you know, it's just forceful kind of Christianity, I think. So the argument was basically, you know, like, insofar as these European fascists are kind of compelled to use pagan pre-Christian traditions as their kind of ideological base, in the same way, or analogically, American fascists have to use evangelical Christianity. And so essentially my contention is, and I would go to bat for this contention still, is that in not all evangelicals, but for the most part, evangelical Christianity is a religion of and an ideology of white supremacy. And that's just kind of
patriarchal, white supremacy for sure.
Right. Yeah, and it's like, and I mean, evil again. You know, just so I can shit on the New York Times again, but they, you know, back in probably 17 or 18. Put out an article. I remember, I think it was I had a habit of for a while, I would read the Sunday edition, just because I like the arts kind of stuff they do. But they had an article about the crisis in evangelical Christianity of congregants of color essentially leaving post Trump, and the white congregants are like, oh, well, why?
I don't get it.
It's just like, fucking people. Like, I know you have brains in your worms, but it's that's clear that you can't understand.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's a long aside. So
yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think that all of us who have attended, I guess, with the caveat of saying like a mostly white church, I think that most of us have experiences where we saw racism in the church. I mean, I saw it really hardcore. Yeah. And we had a couple people of color in our church, but still, I mean, and it came from the pastor. Like, that's embarrassing, but it just shows how deeply intertwined the two things are.
Well, so especially
go ahead, sorry.
No, I was going to say, especially in the context of American Christianity, you only need to look to like the colonization of this country, right? To see how deeply intertwined religious belief was with, the genocide of Native Americans, and just the idea that we're cleansing the land for God, and you've got manifest destiny as a doctrine, and
what's interesting, though, is the theological arguments between, say, North America and South and Central America are different, though. Because up here, North America, there's the sort of city on the hill. There's a really good book. I can't remember the author's name. He's a historian or a cultural anthropologist. He wrote a 3-book series on, starting with pretty much the colonization of New England up through the Civil War, and then kind of Reconstruction frontier era. But for the life of me, I don't know that the first book is called Regeneration Through Violence, but that's a phrase that he reuses several times.
Regeneration Through Violence by Richard Slotkin.
Yeah. And so just to plug another book, so that phrase "regeneration through violence" comes from William Carlos Williams, the poet, wrote a book of kind of, I don't know what you would call it. They're almost prose poems. And so the whole idea is this regeneration through violence is essentially that the American ideology, the American spirit, capital S spirit, if there is such a thing, is profoundly based on this kind of blood sacrifice almost that's necessary to guarantee our national coherence, but which is also like underwritten by this Puritan Christian ideology where, for a variety of reasons, this was seen as virgin land in patterns and habitation patterns, etc. But then there's also the more like woo-woo theological shit of like, well, are Indians people? Which is a through line between North American, South and Central American colonization. But Catholics and Protestants kind of have they have different reasons for arriving at the conclusion of, well, Indians aren't people,
So I'd just like to mention real quick that I'm maybe stupid, and I forgot to record the video this whole time, so half of this is just going to be audio only. Whoops. But I'll upload it to YouTube still. It'll just be a blank screen for a little while. So yeah, let's go back to Crab over here and her notes and what else she wanted to say.
Yeah. So just some of the other things that I kind of battled with in my own mind when I was a kid was also the verse. It shows up in 1 Timothy and in 1 Corinthians. Women should remain silent in the church, to not take over the authority of men, and if the woman or the wife wants to learn, then she's to ask her husband her questions at home. Which was interesting because, again, as someone who was in a church that read the Bible very literally, I tried to fit myself into this ideology where somewhere it was okay, right? Like that I could come to peace with it. And this is so cringy, but I used to pray for like a gentle and I guess like a spirit of submission, right?
Right.
And it was such that's just like a horrible thing. Like psychologically, like that's such a horrible thing for a young girl who is going to grow up and struggle in the patriarchy anyway, right? Like she's already in it and she doesn't know it. But then to kind of have this as her basis of like, this is the right way, this is the way that you're supposed to think and feel. It just really heaps on that struggle of then, okay, now I have to deconstruct this all the way to ground level and then rebuild it. And it's just it's difficult.
Well, yeah,
It's
and you know,
horrible.
on the subject of like praying for things that are
Mm,
just like psychotic almost to have to pray
mm.
for, you know, like that's
Of course.
that's like built
Yeah.
into religion so deeply,
Yeah.
especially Christianity, I think, where it's like if you talk to somebody who'd never experienced any amount of Christianity in their life, and then you told them like, yeah, so I found myself praying for, you know, a gentle spirit that would submit me to my husband, and you know, like when you're praying for that kind of thing, you're also kind of like praying that like, you know, God, please give me a wise husband who doesn't beat me unnecessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, well, because then it's like, yeah, I mean, it's like kind of a double-edged sword of like, not only are you praying for divine inspiration so that you can kind of like, like ignore your own intellect and
Yeah.
kind of self in critical inclination, be subservient, but also a husband who might recognize that critical inclination and yet be, you know, kind of exercise like forbearance and be kind or whatever the fuck. Which is pretty, I mean, that's messy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's, I think that it kind of speaks to that idea, which I kind of had in my notes a little bit later on, but it's this idea of like religion in this context kind of strips away your sense of self, so that you can be like this vessel where God can, just exist in you. And essentially it's like this spiritual abuse that happens where you're constantly having to chip away at who you are if it at all contradicts what the ideology says. And
Right.
that's I mean, it's like pretty classic abuse, right? Like
Yeah,
that's rough.
for
So
sure. Yeah.
that's
Keep going.
that's a fun one. And then another one that I struggled with was this idea that, so women in my church, and this is I believe biblical, well, it is biblical as well, along the lines of like not to usurp the authority of men. Women can't teach, so they couldn't be pastors, ministers, and in fact they could only teach, interestingly enough, children, so
Yeah.
young boys. But once they reached a certain age, the women were no longer allowed to teach them. So what does that say about how men are valued in the church versus women, right? Like you're good enough to teach our boys, but once they get what, better than you, smarter than you, have more authority than you have to sit down.
Well, not even
Interesting,
just
right?
that, but like the way that it's structured, like, you know, you grow up your whole life as a little as a little kid, you know, and pairing this up with something like, you know, the bar mitzvah, like coming of age sort of stuff, you know, when you reach a certain age, you're now considered a man, and that was in, you know, your early teens is when that happens. And then, you know, you're no longer taught by a woman, so you don't have
Right,
a woman's influence over you anymore, and you're
right.
taught exclusively by men who have maybe some incentive to, you
Mm.
know,
Right.
teach you that, you know, your position as a man is above that of a
Right,
woman's, right?
right, for sure. Yeah, it's sad. It's really
So
sad.
yeah, it's like probably intentional, but a form of indoctrination that self perpetuates, right?
Yeah.
It also just flouts millennia of church tradition in which women are absolutely central to
Mm,
not only like Christ's life, but then also
mm,
his message. Like, you know, there's any number of female martyrs
Right.
mm,
in it's kind of
Well, that's the thing, right? Is that, that the only time a woman is valued and has a position of power is when she's sacrificing herself
Ooh, preach.
for,
Yep.
for the for the
Nancy
religion.
Pelosi, thank you, George Floyd, for
Oh, yeah. So bad.
like thanks Agatha, I think would have been
Right.
thanks Agatha for getting your head chopped off by the
Yeah.
Romans.
So
Yeah.
that we could learn that the Romans were bad.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's very much linked to what you're saying in that I think that a big part of that is obviously the disempowerment of a woman's voice in the church so that she remains in those subservient roles, right?
Right.
Which ultimately benefit the church. And even if, I mean, power dynamics, obviously, but also I was thinking like just in terms of saving money, the women, if there's any event, they cook, maybe sometimes they clean, they run all of the children's programs, they, all of this is expected to be their effort, their time is expected to be given voluntarily.
Yeah,
That
it's
saves
all donated, right?
yeah, that saves a lot of money, right?
Well, and I think what's so cruel about that kind of um, ideology of disempowerment and submission and subservience is that it exploits natural biological and psychological predilections that are shared between the genders of wanting intimacy, wanting to remain in group, um, and yeah, I mean, it exploits those and ascribes these kind of moral directives onto what are ultimately just value neutral biological impulses.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and it really speaks to this idea. I've been taking this course that's kind of deconstructing motherhood martyrdom. Um, being myself, I became a mom a few years ago, and it's just kind of it's so crushing in a way, the societal expectations of a woman and a mother. And as I've been going through this course and kind of deconstructing that on a cultural level, the link between what I learned in church and that is obviously so strongly associated. It's just crazy. It's that idea again, the emptying of self, not even the emptying, but the destruction of self. And Mike and I talked about this a little bit of like, why can't the two things exist? Like, why can't you be a mother and also hold space for your child's identity? Or why can't you, be religious and have your own sense of self and also hold, a sense of self for a deity? Like, why do they have to be one or the other, right? Like that's such an interesting thing to
Well,
me.
and that's kind of like, it seems like one thing that I've noted in talking to observant evangelicals. So there was a woman that I worked with who um, was roughly my age. So at the time, mid 20s. Part of the confusion for her was Catholic Mariology. So Roman Catholic veneration of Mary.
Mm.
And more broadly, the Catholic veneration of saints.
Mm.
And there's this way in which evangelicals are so focused, at least in discourse, on Jesus, where it's not even God. It's this as this kind of like but frankly, and here like the dick comes out, and I'm just like, but like evangelical theology is like too dumb to delve into the problem of being at once divine and human. And so Jesus becomes this like all evangelicals are like wedded to Jesus in a certain way, kind of. And
No, that's actually
yeah.
That's actually part of the doctrine.
Yeah. Yep.
It actually like literally is. Like that's just my like so it actually like I'm not just like pulling
no. That's part of doctrine that even and this will come up in church sometimes when it's like a hee it's funny and weird sort of thing. But like yeah, we're not gay, but even men are wedded to Christ, boys. And like
well, I mean that's kind of like I don't know. I guess there's an analogous thing in Catholicism would be like transubstantiation, the debate over the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. I mean, which I don't know, like I hold to that not because I'm not a Catholic, like I'm not a practicing Catholic, but I hold to that because I understand its philosophical lineage and its basis or logicalness, which I know isn't a word, in the context of like Hellenic and Judaic philosophy. Yeah, like of course that makes sense. Like that's a logically valid or true thing to say.
Right.
Do you have more stuff, or like can I like toss out a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Also, like one thing I'm curious about, especially as a mother and as a woman too, is like I'm just curious about like the way in which children are kind of are or are not like, or what is the status of like the sexualization of female people in the church? Because I mean, like my impression is more or less that in keeping with this overall kind of imposed or prescribed subservience, that like women are essentially like kind of like what you're saying, you know, they provide this uncompensated domestic labor, but then on the even beyond that, which is, and similarly and even more physically and presumably spiritually onerous, like women are essentially just like kind of brood mares. So I just like, I don't know how true that is, but I'm curious about like kind of, because also there's the whole thing of like the purity balls or whatever.
Yeah.
Teen girls are bound to their fathers until marriage, which is just like gross.
It's really gross. I'm glad that you brought this up because it's a huge part of it. This idea of purity culture, which I think was one of the most, I mean, there's so much damage, right, that you get from being raised this way. I think that this was one of the most damaging, because purity culture for, as you say, like normies, people who might not have been raised in the church, is the idea that sex should be saved for heterosexual monogamous marriage for life, right? So, I mean, unless your partner dies, and then I guess you're free to do the thing again, over again.
But preferably it's his brother that you met.
It's his brother.
Keep it in the
exactly.
family.
And if he doesn't have a brother, I think it's his father or something like that.
Yeah,
So,
it gets weird.
It gets weird.
The family tree just kind of starts looping in on itself.
Exactly. And in my particular brand of purity culture, some people that I knew, grew up with, even saved their first kiss for their wedding day, which was extremely awkward to witness. But yeah, it's essentially, it's the way I see it, is the erasure of female sexuality in the church. You're not allowed to be seen as a sexual being, and you basically are supposed to suppress and disconnect from all sexual urges that you may have as a teen, which, you know, is easy and cool and healthy. And the responsibility is very much placed on girls to safeguard their own libidos and that of their peers, their male peers, with the assumption that they're straight. And by being told that they are supposed to dress in a certain way, they have to avoid dressing other ways. So you might stand up and you're wearing a skirt, and you have to make sure your skirt's past your fingertips when you stand, and your shirt can't be, you know, a V-neck. It has to go all the way up to your collarbone. And it's largely predicated on the use of shame to keep girls in line. And again, I think distracted so that they can remain in those subservient roles. And yeah, it's something that even if you deconstruct, something that you deal with for, I don't want to say life, because I'm hopeful that it gets easier with time and deconstruction, but it's something that I still struggle with. And I've deconstructed for, I mean, I kind of started, I would say, about 10 years ago, and more hardcore once I became a mother. So not that long, but it's very deeply rooted for sure.
One other question I had. So you know, my in my educational and philosophical background, deconstruction is a term of art related to, you know, Jacques Derrida. So is deconstruction a word in community for evangelicals that essentially equates to like apostasy, or what, or is it just a word that you two are using just idiomatically? Like, does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that it's more used once you're out of
Okay.
I think when you're in the in religion, in evangelicalism, they would call it like you're leaving the fold, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Or you're what's the biggest one that they use? It's like you're the lost sheep, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Like you go away and the shepherd has to find you again. It's sort of like that verbiage that's used around it. But once you're out, there's this culture that is kind of still on the rise, but people starting to talk about this idea of deconstruction. I first learned about it through, I first read this book called Leaving the Fold, I think, is Dr. Marlene Winnell. And she coined the term religious trauma syndrome. So it's it's super fascinating. And she talks about deconstruction of religion, but I'm sure other people use that term as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, because it's kind of funny because, like, so like my background is largely in literary theory, which itself is just secularized biblical hermeneutics. Like that's literally historically where literary theory comes from, is late 19th century kind of attempts to as like literature became more of a mass media or mass experience. It was, there was a coterminous, and of course now I'm gonna start talking about, I'm gonna use all these just obnoxious $5 words. There was a coterminous secularization. And part of the problem is like, I would have to think harder to say that simpler than it is for me to just use stupid words.
Right.
Are too many syllables long. But anyways, religious trauma syndrome. What is because I'm assuming there would probably be some sort of like similarities and overlaps with like something like PTSD or I mean, honestly, presumably, like I wouldn't even be surprised if there were overlaps with something like a cluster B personality disorder, where those people who experience those, it's because of like pretty intense childhood trauma. So what does she kind of identify, and like to whatever degree you're comfortable with, what have you recognized in your own life kind of cognitively or emotionally that jives with that construct?
I think it's an interesting question. I think that for me, a lot of it was more of like a visceral response to religion. I could feel trauma in my body before I knew what trauma was, right? Like the CPTSD kind of idea. And that was really kind of what kickstarted my deconstruction with religion, was because I finally had the words to describe how I felt. It was like, oh my God, like this is a thing. Like it was that validation of like, yes, someone else understands that this is like a trauma response. And it's something that I still need to kind of delve more into. I read her book, but there's other people who talk about like spiritual abuse, and what does that mean? It's this idea that like, as if you believe in spirituality of humanity, which some people do and some people don't, kind of like to each their own, but if you kind of accept that as an idea, then forcing someone and indoctrinating someone to believe from the time that they were born something that's so harmful, I'd call it spiritual abuse for sure. Right? Like it kind of it's like the brainworm thing. Like it gets into your psyche and it's so hard to separate it.
Well, I mean, especially because again, taking seriously the proposition that we live in a Judeo-Christian culture, country, there are secularized ways in which this biblical misogyny or other bigotries, are secularized cultural mainstays for us. And then, but also it's doubled and amplified by still being in a religious community that, you know, has that baseline, but then also still adheres to this bit like theological argument for that higher, you know what I mean? Like there, it's one thing to say like, well, it's, I guess, I don't know, like it's one thing to talk about like the gender wage gap, for example, but then, and to because that issue, you know, you can go down any number of sociological materialist explanations, but then, you know, if you were to bring all that to an evangelical, you know, they're just gonna be like, well, Bible says so, doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, there's no crossing that river, you know, like that's you've hit a wall.
So I kind of wanted to jump in on this a little bit, talking about like spiritual abuse. As Crab has experienced, being a friend of mine for a long time, I went through a period of like intense like militant atheism where I rejected the idea that, you know, like spirituality could even exist, and if you had any kind of spirituality about you, like you were just a dumb fucking person that you know. And she's saying because I was a real douchebag to her a couple of times. But you know, going through that period of my life, and now maybe in the last couple of years, I've learned that I do have a spirituality about me, and you know, I mean, I'm a person who tries to make art sometimes, and I write poetry, and I, you know, engage in all these other sort of things, and it's like trying to refine a spirituality that doesn't, you know, immediately evoke all those feelings that I had when I was in the church, you know, finding a spirituality that's healthy and born out of, you know, like my own individualism rather than a spirituality that's shaped and formed by this religious institution.
It's very difficult. I think that it's very, I think for people who are deconstructing and then trying to reconstruct, which is kind of that idea with the finding your spirituality again, I think that it can be very triggering because it draws forth so many of those really deep rooted ideas of what we were taught, especially when you're in it when you're a kid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just sent you guys a link. I don't know if you can get that. This is Dr. Marlene's site, the one who wrote the book, and it's Symptoms of Religious Trauma Syndrome. So she says it's cognitive, emotional, social, and cultural. And then causes of religious trauma syndrome would be suppression of normal child development, cognitive, social, emotional, moral stages are arrested, damage to normal thinking and feeling abilities, information is limited and controlled, dysfunctional beliefs taught, you know, that women aren't as good as men, independent thinking condemned. So, and also like thought policing, and your feelings are condemned. I think a lot of it is emotionally based. External locus of control, knowledge is revealed, not discovered. The hierarchy of authority enforced, self not a reliable or good source. You're definitely taught not to trust yourself. Because in the ideology it's the self is evil, right? The self is demonized. You're born terrible and you need to be saved. And again, that was one of the bigger things that led me to deconstruct as well, especially once I became a mother. It was horrifying to me that any mother could look at her child and think, what a precious, beautiful baby that I have, and yet they're just wicked in their heart, you know, like they're just bad. Like I don't, that's abusive. That's a horrible teaching. It's horrible.
As an anti-natalist, I'm prone to agree with. I'm just kidding. your child is very very adorable and a very cute little guy.
You're a big old softie. You can pretend, but
This is the hazard of bringing on somebody that knows me. I can't get away with all my bullshit edgelord stuff.
No, you definitely can't.
It's interesting. I scrolled down on that page to the mistaken identity section, and she does have their borderline personality disorder, which so that's a cluster B personality disorder. social disorders, I mean, antisocial personality disorder, the narcissism, those are cluster B as well. Like there, and that's kind of like, so like I have in my like personal life, not myself, but former, former people in my life, have experience with cluster B types. And knowing what I know about the origins or probable origins of those factors for them, it makes sense that being raised in that kind of environment, which is all encompassing, like it's a total life. And that truly, and I think it is worth noting, like that is a fundamental difference between Catholics and evangelicals specifically. And it is also something that evangelicals kind of, in my conversations with this former coworker of mine, because we've talked about, like, we were on good terms, we've talked about this stuff. It wasn't hostile, but like, she was very kind of confused by what she perceived as a lack of fellowship among Catholics, which is absolutely like true. Like Catholicism is not interested in building fellowship. It's interested in getting your ass in the pew,
right,
and listening to the priest and going out, and doing whatever. But it is, especially now with just sociological factors of, or I don't even know what to call it, like a cultural a-religiousness, Catholicism truly is a matter of, you go to church once a week, maybe. If you're real old school, you might go several times a week. But even like, my family who are, Catholic boomers, go once a week. My grandfather, who's, I don't know, close to 90, I think pre-COVID, he would have gone probably at least 75% of the days out of the week. But also going to church just is not fellowship. It's not, it's not, you don't have any sort of emotional, affective connection to those people other than, oh, hey, I talked to Bob and Mary after Mass at the donut social,
Yeah, that seems like Catholicism has a lot more of like a punch card sort of relationship going on, right? Like you just, all right, I put my hour in and we're good.
And there's historical reasons for that. I mean, like part of the cultural difference between Catholicism and evangelicalism is that well, so one, there's a question of like literacy, like literal just literacy, where Catholicism, there's this much more prescriptive kind of even institutional structure, obviously, in the priesthood and the Vatican, meaning that pre-modern, you were dependent upon institutional interpretation, whereas evangelicalism, again, as like I've kind of signposted, is like relativism. There's this living document that everyone is kind of entitled to read and hold close to their heart, which is just not true of Catholic practice. And the holdover is, even as mass literacy is a thing, I would hazard to guess that if you were to just do a straw poll of practicing Catholics versus evangelicals, and if you were literally just to ask, have you ever read the Bible? How much of the Bible have you read? What was the context of you reading the Bible? Because with Catholics, the context of reading the Bible, it would be if they were sent to Catholic parochial schools. It would be if they went to Sunday school in order to receive First Communion, confirmation, etc. Whereas my understanding of evangelicalism is that it is a much more organic aspect of life.
Yeah.
which itself is, for as much as evangelicals seem to believe that they are living out this original churchly lifestyle, that's profoundly modern. Like
for sure.
if we were to go back 1,500 2,000 years ago,
right,
the only people reading religious texts would have been whenever there were ecumenical councils or institution of or the church fathers. It wouldn't have been it wouldn't even have been the kinds of people or the demographics that, like, say, the apostles or Jesus were drawn from, that would be reading and sharing.
yeah,
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a
Anyway.
select class of people who are literate, right, in that time and age. And one of the only things they're reading is the Bible, and the only way that the average person engages with the Bible is by being told what it says. Versus, and I think Protestantism is largely a factor or a result of, like a spread of literacy and people being able to read the Bible for themselves and being able to go, hey, you're not supposed to sell us our salvation, and but now we've got an issue with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the Gutenberg Bible.
Yeah.
Like, it literally, the advent of mass printing and the Reformation are almost smack dab on the same kind of timeline.
Yep.
And I think
all right.
one of the big problems that's okay. One of the big problems that comes out of that is being when religion is so enmeshed in your life. Like, I went to Sunday school and church. I went to Wednesday church service for children, and I went to a private Christian school. And and the sports that I played were through a Christian organization. So literally there was no way out, right? Like, it's everything in your life. And so, like, of course it's kind of that piled on trauma of you're getting it from, like, there's no escape, essentially.
I'm gonna
So what
real quick, I have a question, because this was brought up in Dorian's workshop the other day, and I want to see if Crab has the same answer that I did. Why do you think the youth group service always happens on Wednesdays in churches?
Dude, I went to Wednesday youth group.
Yeah, I know. It's always Wednesday, and I want to see if Crab has the same answer that I had.
I'd imagine it's because it's right before the weekend, so they kind of want to, like, hit you over the head a little bit to make you feel bad, so you don't go drink and party and stuff on the weekend.
That's exactly what I said. Was it's like catching you in the middle of the week. It's catching you in the middle of the week when you've been away from the church for a little bit, and they're making sure that you haven't strayed from the path. Yeah. Okay. I'm glad that you have the same
I'm also
answer.
laughing. I'm also laughing because I just remember that I took you to my youth group once, and that's hilarious to me.
Yep.
Well, for me, like, I was friends with people who would go, and, like, at the time we were kind of like, I wasn't a huge druggie. They were bigger druggies than I was, but I would say at least half the time we went to youth group together, we'd have, roasted a bone before. So the don't party, don't sex, don't drug and rock and roll message was lost on us, and we were actually kind of like, hey, Jesus fucking rocks, let's go get high.
That's
call no thing which he has made impure, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that's where a lot of the purity culture stuff, at least in my church, was really taught, was at, like, that Wednesday youth group. It was like, let's, like, come down really hard on this teaching here with, once it's just the kids. And sometimes you wonder, like, I don't know, if the parents were in there, like, would they be cool with it? Like, it's pretty horrible teaching, but I suppose they would be.
So were your were the youth groups that you went to, were they co-ed, or would they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, mine were co-ed, yeah.
Gotcha. So what was the content, what was the tenor of instruction there? Like, what was the order of business that, like, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I think it was mostly focused on, I don't know about you, Mike, but mine was mostly focused on like the purity culture stuff of like, this is how we remain pure. This is how we honor God with our bodies, like stuff like that. These teachings, I didn't even think about that. That just like came out of my brain because it's so drilled in there. But yeah, it was like, how do we live a life that is honoring and pleasing to God? And it's by never having sex and never kissing people and never, you know.
So there was that, and the other thing I remember from mine was so they're obviously very heavy in the purity culture stuff, and then the second thing was like learning about like the radical young people of the Bible who, you know, like eventually went on to be martyrs or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of funny. So the youth group that I went to, I'm from Cincinnati. I don't really give a shit. I don't know that I would be
docs.
Yeah.
I'm also showing my face, so whatever. But so I'm from Cincinnati. Xavier University is there, which is the Jesuit university. Big shout out to the Jesuits, aside from whatever their role in like the Inquisition is or whatever. I don't know. But the campus church that's attached, Bellarmine, is it's super liberal. The NPR, New York Times, granola, Prius driving kind of liberal, like those kinds of people. So the person who ran the youth group, who's just a sweetheart, like in my opinion, like I haven't talked to her in years, but to me is just like a true living saint, loves young people. The depth of her conviction that, you know, it's important for young Catholics to have like a healthy relationship to God, just non-judgmental, true, like open arms person. It was funny. It was funny one time she wanted me to like lead this meeting on the Bible and queerness because she knew that I was like a young queer, and I was just like, I mean, like, I don't know, bro. Like, that's, thanks for thinking of me, but also like 14 years old and I don't really know anything about this, and all I know is like I like to suck dick and youth group. So like, I don't know, man.
It's also like that cringy thing of like, you're queer, you teach it. It's like, wait a minute, it's not my responsibility.
Yeah, it's like, hey, dude, like you're literally like 60 years old and I'm 14. Like, I've never read the Bible. Presumably, you read the Bible. Like, fucking, you have at it, and I'll try. You know. You know.
No.
All right, well, Crab, do you have any last words? We're running a little bit long for what we normally do here, but this has been a good talk.
I don't think so. Yeah, I think I covered most of what I wanted to talk about.
We could probably have you back on sometime.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for your time today. I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday as we just created some form of sacrilege or engaged in some form of sacrilege.
We sure did.
This one was arguably more wholesome than the last one that we did together, because I think on the last one is when I encouraged people to murder their children.
You did, yeah.
Yeah, you did.
The last one is where you.
Yeah.
Again,
so I haven't done that.
It's the hazard of having somebody on who's known me for a long time. I can't get away with all the edgelord shit.
Yeah, I'll yell at you afterwards. How dare you?
Well, and just to be very clear, like, I'm pro-abortion, not because I'm pro-woman, but because I'm anti-child. So,
there we go. Antinatalist gang, where you at?
Stop.
All right. Well, thank you both. Have a wonderful Sunday.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Go with Christ, babies.
Yeah.
Hi. Michael Deebs here, with no gun pointed at my head. Please know that all content created for the Benzo Rehab Dungeon is, and always will be, freely available. However, if you would like to support this creation of content, we here at Camp Benzo would appreciate it, as the production itself is not free of cost. Anything donated will go to covering the various subscription fees maintained for content production or improving and expanding the content produced. If you're able to, please head on over to patreon.com/Benzo Rehab Dungeon. We also have shirts for sale on Teespring, all priced as low as we can get them without turning much or any profit. They are mostly so that you can show your loved ones that a necessary intervention may be on the horizon. Links to the merchandise storefront and our various social media profiles can be found on our link tree, which is the word linktr.ee/Benzo Rehab Dungeon. As always, we love you. Please take your medicine.